Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of research from PLOS ONE that tackles a super common yet complicated modern workplace dilemma. We are looking at global mobility, and specifically, we're focusing on the dynamic between foreign-born employees and their managers. So here's the core question we are going to try to answer today. Does a direct supervisor's own international experience actually help their foreign-born employees adjust to a new workplace? I know, it sounds like a simple yes, right? But as we'll see, the reality of human interaction in the office is beautifully complex. Let's dive in.
Here is our roadmap for today. To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to follow the exact structure of the peer-reviewed paper. First up, the theoretical framework. Second, the empirical work. Third, discussing the results. And finally, real-world implications.
Section 1. The theoretical framework.
Okay, before we get to the data, we need to understand the players. Our core subject today is the SIE, or self-initiated expatriate. Now, we're not talking about your traditional corporate expat who gets relocated with a massive corporate support package, housing allowances, and 6 weeks of cultural training. No, SIEs are folks who just pack their bags and voluntarily relocate to a foreign country completely on their own initiative. They are navigating a new culture, a new city, and a completely new organizational environment entirely by themselves. Because of this, their adjustment period is inherently much more vulnerable. They heavily rely on whatever social support they can find once they arrive, and that means they really rely on their direct supervisors. So to understand how supervisors help or, fail to help these SIEs, the researchers use something called signaling theory. Think of this literally like a giant two-way radio setup. The new SIE access the transmitter. Because they're in this new, totally unfamiliar environment, they are constantly sending out uncertainty signals. Sometimes these are direct questions, sure, but a lot of the time they're subtle. We're talking hesitation, rising intonation, or just uncertain body language. The direct supervisor, on the other hand, acts as the receiver. But here's the absolute crucial point. Just because a signal is transmitted doesn't mean it's received. The supervisor has to actually be tuned to the right frequency to pick up on these signals and interpret them correctly. And that brings us to our second theoretical lens, similarity attraction theory. Basically, this is the psychological principle that we are naturally drawn to and interact much more positively with people who share our background. In this context, if a supervisor also has a background of living internationally, that shared experience creates an initial really powerful point of connection. It essentially tunes the supervisor's radio receiver to the exact frequency that the SIE is transmitting on.
Section 2. The empirical work.
So, how did the researchers take these abstract theories and actually test them out in the real world? Well, they conducted a highly focused qualitative study of 20 semi-structured interviews right here in the United States. Every single one of these participants was a supervisor who managed at least one self-initiated expatriate. They spent about half an hour with each supervisor, really digging deep into their managerial experiences until they hit what researchers call thematic saturation, basically the point where no new themes are popping up in the data. But here is where the study gets super clever. They didn't just interview one monolith of a manager. They split their sample into two distinct cohorts. 14 of the supervisors were immigrants themselves, foreign-born supervisors who had navigated the U.S. system. The other 6 were locally born U.S. supervisors, but they had significant international experience, like working or studying abroad for extended periods. This is a brilliant distinction because it allows us to see if just any international experience is enough, or if the specific lived experience of being an immigrant fundamentally changes how you manage. To make sense of all those conversations, the researchers rigorously categorized the raw interview data. They mapped out a beautifully logical flow, tracking the demographic data, then looking at exactly how supervisors interpret uncertainty signals, the reactions those signals elicit, and finally, the presumed effects on the SIE's work and non-work adjustment. It's all about moving from observation to interpretation to concrete action. Section 3. Discussing the results. Let's dive right into what the data actually revealed about these workplace dynamics. The most common uncertainty signals that supervisors picked up on fell into 3 main buckets. First, language barriers were huge, thick accents or just hesitation when speaking. Second, cultural differences, which included things like appearance, food, or grouping behaviors. And finally, work environment signals, like totally different baseline understandings of organizational culture. But here is the major game-changing takeaway from the data. Foreign-born supervisors were much, much more adept at noticing these cues. The locally born supervisors with international experience, they noticed far fewer signals. They might have physically seen the behavior, but their receivers just weren't tuned properly to recognize them as cries for help. So why are foreign-born managers so much better at tuning in? One participant perfectly captured the reason. They said they mapped their own past struggles directly onto the experiences of their new employees. Because they had to go through the ringer to adjust themselves, they have this deeply embedded empathy. When they see an employee hesitating, they don't just jump to, oh, poor communication skills. They actually recognize the complex, terrifying uncertainty of navigating a second language in a totally foreign corporate culture. But, and this is absolutely crucial, that shared experience, it's a double-edged sword. One of the most surprising findings was that foreign-born supervisors were actually more likely to stereotype or make generalized assumptions based on nationality. For instance, if they had a past negative experience with an employee from a specific region, they might become automatically biased when a new person from that same region was hired. The researchers suggest this might actually be a byproduct of assimilation. As foreign-born supervisors integrate deeply into the host culture over time, they might unconsciously distance themselves from new outsiders, leading to some really quick, unfair judgments. Okay, so once a supervisor actually interprets a signal, what actions do they take? The data shows a massive spike in support for work adjustment, like giving extra training, and interaction adjustment, like adapting how they communicate. But when it comes to general non-work adjustment, there is practically zero support. Almost universally, supervisors provide very little help for the SIE's life outside the office. Managers tend to feel that navigating housing, personal finances, or just general life adjustment is simply outside their professional boundaries. And this is a huge problem because those external stressors heavily impact work performance. Section 4, real-world implications. So how do we take all these academic findings and apply them to the real world? Well, for starters, international experience is definitely not a monolith. A local manager who studied abroad for a year simply does not possess the same cultural radar as an immigrant who uprooted their life to build a new one. Also, this idea that minority foreign-born supervisors can actually stereotype new immigrants opens up entirely new avenues for understanding in-group and out-group biases at work. And clearly, the lack of support for life outside of work remains a massive, glowing blind spot in current management practices. For the HR professionals and managers listening, there are 3 really clear, actionable steps you can take today. Step 1. Strategically place your self-initiated expatriates into supervisory roles. Because they're already highly attuned to those subtle uncertainty signals, they can dramatically reduce turnover among your new international hires. Step 2, you literally cannot assume a manager knows how to handle a multinational team just because they like to travel. You've got to implement specific, targeted, cross-cultural support training. And step 3, establish mentoring programs that bridge that non-work gap. Give these employees the holistic support they need to truly integrate, not just a manual on how to clock in and do their tasks. I want to leave you with a provocative question. Whether you have lived abroad yourself or not, think about the people on your team right now. Are they transmitting subtle cues of uncertainty that you are simply not tuned in to catch? Empathy and awareness require active listening, both to what is being said and what is being left unspoken. Thank you so much for joining us on this explainer. Keep tuning your receiver and we'll catch you next time.